Imagine, if you will, stepping into a grand ballroom in 1530. The candlelight flickers across marble floors, casting dancing shadows on tapestried walls. The air is thick with the scent of rosewater and the whispered secrets of European nobility. Now picture a woman moving gracefully through this glittering world. A woman who has survived betrayals that would crush most souls, who has risen to wield power that kings envy. This woman is about to change history forever, not through conquest or intrigue, but through something so small, so ordinary that it defies all logic. This is the story of Margaret of Austria, and how a single fragment of glass brought down one of the most powerful women who ever lived. Close your eyes and transport yourself to the year 1480, to a world where daughters are currency and marriage certificates are battle plans. In the magnificent Duchy of Burgundy, where merchant ships heavy with silk and spice crowd the harbors, a baby girl takes her first breath. She doesn't know it yet, but her tiny fingers will one day sign treaties that reshape nations. Her infant cries echo through chambers that have witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties. This is Margaret, daughter of Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor, and Mary of Burgundy. From the moment her lungs fill with air, her life belongs not to her, but to the chess masters of European politics who see her as nothing more than a pawn to be moved across their grand board. Picture little Margaret at age 3, barely out of swaddling clothes, when her father's advisors gather around mahogany tables covered in maps and treaties. They speak of her future as if she were a piece of property to be sold. "The French alliance," they murmur, their quills scratching across parchment. "She'll marry Charles, the Dauphin." With those words, her childhood is auctioned away before she can even speak in full sentences. Can you imagine it? At 10 years old, when most children are chasing butterflies in garden meadows, Margaret is torn from everything she knows and loaded onto a carriage bound for the French court. The wheels creak and groan as they carry her toward a foreign land where every smile masks a dagger and every compliment conceals a trap. She presses her small face against the carriage window, watching her homeland disappear forever, not knowing if she'll ever see it again. The French court of King Charles VIII is a glittering prison of silk and ceremony. Picture Margaret, now a homesick child surrounded by strangers who speak in riddles and bow with calculated precision. She learns their language until she speaks it like a native. She masters their customs, their dances, their elaborate games of courtesy. For 7 long years, she prepares herself to become Queen of France, believing with the innocent faith of youth that her suffering has a purpose, that her sacrifice will be rewarded. But here's where our story takes its first cruel turn. It's 1491, and Margaret is 11 years old. She's in her chambers, perhaps practicing her French pronunciations or writing letters to her distant father, when her tutors arrive with faces pale as winter morning. "Your Highness," they stammer, their voices barely above a whisper, "there's been a change in plans. Charles, the boy she's been promised to since she could barely walk, has decided he wants someone else. Not just any someone else, but Anne of Brittany, whose dowry includes strategic ports and fertile lands that France covets. Margaret isn't just rejected, she's discarded like yesterday's bread, thrown away with no more thought than one might give to emptying chamber pots. Feel the humiliation burning in her 11-year-old chest. Watch as courtiers who once bowed and scraped now look through her as if she's invisible. Their whispered conversations follow her down corridors like hissing serpents. The Austrian girl. Yes, the one who was returned like damaged goods. The journey back to her father's lands is a parade of shame that scars her soul. At 11, Margaret learns her first bitter lesson. Love means nothing when weighed against political advantage, and even the most solemn promises crumble like ancient parchment when profit calls. But Margaret is stronger than anyone imagines. Picture her now at 17, standing before another altar in another foreign land. Spain this time. Golden Spain with its sun-baked courtyards and the sound of fountains echoing off Moorish tiles. She's marrying Prince John, heir to the combined thrones of Castile and Aragon, and for 6 precious months she tastes happiness. John is kind. More than kind, he's genuinely interested in her thoughts, her dreams, her fears. They walk together through orange groves heavy with fruit, their laughter mixing with the song of nightingales. Margaret dares to hope again. She learns Spanish with the same determination she once applied to French. She throws herself into court life, believing that finally, she might claim the crown that was stolen from her in childhood. But fate, it seems, has marked Margaret for suffering. October 1497. Picture Margaret waking to find her husband burning with fever, his skin hot as forge fire, his breathing shallow and labored. She holds his hand as his life ebbs away like wine from a cracked cup. Tuberculosis, they whisper, or perhaps it was typhoid. The cause matters less than the devastating fact. At 17, Margaret is a widow. But the cruelty doesn't end there. She's pregnant, carrying what would have been an heir to the Spanish throne. The stress and grief of losing John causes her body to rebel, and she miscarries the child who might have secured her place in Spanish society forever. Can you feel her anguish? In the span of weeks, she loses both her husband and her unborn child. The Spanish courtiers who once celebrated her arrival now whisper that she's cursed, that she brings death to any man who loves her. Their superstitious fears follow her like shadows, and Margaret begins to believe them herself. Return with me now to 1501. Margaret, scarred by loss but not broken, stands once more in wedding white. This time it's Philibert II, Duke of Savoy, waiting at the altar. She's 21 now, no longer the trusting girl who once believed in fairy tale endings. She approaches this marriage like a seasoned diplomat approaching treaty negotiations, hopeful but cautious, ready for betrayal but praying for kindness. And for 3 miraculous years, she finds both love and respect. Philibert doesn't just tolerate her intelligence, he celebrates it. He asks her opinion on matters of state, includes her in diplomatic discussions, treats her as a true partner rather than a beautiful ornament. Their court becomes a haven of learning, where artists and scholars gather to debate philosophy and science. Margaret flourishes like a rose finally planted in fertile soil. She patronizes musicians and painters, builds one of Europe's finest libraries, and learns the intricate art of governance by watching her husband navigate the treacherous waters of international politics. For the first time in her life, she's valued for her mind rather than merely her bloodline. But her curse, for by now she surely sees it as such, strikes again with devastating precision. Philibert dies in a hunting accident, thrown from his horse while chasing a stag through autumn forests. Margaret, now 24, has buried 2 husbands and lost a child. The grief this time cuts deeper because the love was real, because she had tasted genuine happiness and had it torn away through no fault of her own. She retreats to a convent, seriously considering taking religious vows and abandoning the world that has brought her such persistent anguish. Picture her in a sparse cell, candlelight flickering across tear-stained letters as she pours her heart out to distant relatives. God has made it clear that happiness in marriage is not my destiny. But then comes the offer that will transform her from victim into victor. Her father needs a regent for the Netherlands, someone to govern one of Europe's wealthiest regions until her young nephew Charles comes of age. The appointment of a woman to such a position is revolutionary, scandalous even. Most European nobles view it as desperate expedience, a temporary measure until a real ruler can be found. Margaret accepts, not out of duty alone, but from a recognition that governance might provide the purpose that personal happiness has failed to deliver. Picture her arrival in Mechelen in 1507, 27 years old and carrying the weight of repeated tragedy. The nobles who must now bow to her barely conceal their resentment. Military commanders question every order. Foreign ambassadors demand to speak with real representatives of Habsburg power. But Margaret possesses something her critics lack: genuine understanding of how power works in practice rather than theory. Her years of observation in various courts have taught her to read the motivations behind pretty speeches and Identify the real sources of influence in any political situation. Watch as she transforms skepticism into respect through sheer competence. When France threatens invasion in 1508, viewing the female regent as easy prey, Margaret doesn't prepare for military confrontation her smaller forces couldn't win. Instead, she weaves a web of diplomatic brilliance that makes the political costs of invasion too high and the military risks too uncertain. She offers trade concessions to England for naval support, promises territorial adjustments to German princes for military assistance, even negotiates with the Pope to have French aggression declared a threat to Christian unity. Her diplomatic maneuvering proves masterful. The threatened invasion never materializes. Throughout the 1510s, Margaret's reputation grows like a flower opening to sunlight. She successfully manages the complex transition as Charles comes of age, ensuring stability when he inherits the Spanish crown in 1516 and is elected Holy Roman Emperor in 1519. Her careful financial management eliminates debts that plague most European governments. Her greatest triumph comes in 1519 during the imperial election. Picture the scene. Corrupt German electors literally auctioning their votes to the highest bidder. Margaret coordinates much of Charles's campaign, using her network of contacts and her understanding of each elector's vulnerabilities to secure victory over Francis I of France. The irony is delicious. The woman discarded by France as a child plays a crucial role in denying the French king the greatest prize in European politics. By 1520, Margaret has achieved something unprecedented. She doesn't merely survive the betrayals and tragedies that might have destroyed her. She uses them as foundation stones for a power that transcends traditional gender roles. The scared child humiliated at the French court has become one of the most influential political figures of her age. Yet, even at the pinnacle of success, she remains haunted by personal loss. She never remarries after Philibert's death, despite numerous proposals from nobles who recognize the value of alliance with such a powerful woman. When asked about her refusal to seek another husband, she replies with characteristic dignity, "God has made it clear that happiness in marriage is not my destiny, but perhaps I can find purpose in other forms of service." Her court in Mechlin becomes a Renaissance jewel, rivaling Italian city-states in its cultural sophistication. She corresponds with humanist scholars throughout Europe, debates theology with visiting priests, and maintains a library that draws researchers from across the continent. Yet those who know her well notice she rarely smiles, that even her greatest triumphs seem to bring little personal joy. The weight of constant responsibility takes its toll. Contemporary accounts describe frequent headaches, digestive problems, and periods of melancholy that last for weeks. Modern historians suspect Margaret suffers from what we'd now recognize as chronic depression, the psychological legacy of repeated trauma and loss. Despite her health problems, she continues governing with remarkable effectiveness throughout the 1520s. In 1529, she negotiates the Treaty of Cambrai, ending years of warfare between Habsburg and French spheres of influence. The treaty is considered a diplomatic masterpiece, securing favorable terms for Charles while avoiding the massive military expenditures bankrupting other European powers. Foreign observers note that Margaret achieves through negotiation what other rulers require armies to accomplish. She has become the most respected female leader since antiquity, a woman who commands the attention of kings and the fear of enemies. But fate, which has tormented Margaret throughout her life, prepares one final grotesque irony. December morning, 1530. Picture Margaret walking through her palace in Mechlin, perhaps reviewing diplomatic correspondence or planning her day's audiences. The floors gleam with fresh polishing, and winter sunlight streams through tall windows, casting geometric patterns across marble tiles. She doesn't see the tiny fragment of glass, debris from a wine goblet broken during the previous evening's reception and inadequately cleaned by servants. It's no larger than a child's fingernail, invisible against the complex pattern of the floor. The cut is minor, barely more than a scratch on her foot's sole. Margaret dismisses it as insignificant, and her physicians initially agree. In an age when people regularly survive far more serious wounds, this seems utterly trivial, but the glass carries bacteria that medieval medicine cannot identify or combat. Within days, the small wound shows signs of infection. Margaret's foot swells and grows painful, forcing her to limit activities and delegate responsibilities. As infection spreads up her leg, physicians try every remedy known to 16th century medicine. Poultices of herbs and honey, bloodletting to balance her humors, medicinal preparations that promise miraculous cures. When these treatments fail, the tissue around the wound begins to blacken, signs modern medicine would recognize as gangrene. By late December, Margaret's physicians recommend amputation of the affected leg. In an era before anesthesia or antibiotics, such surgery is extraordinarily dangerous, but gangrene is invariably fatal if left untreated. Margaret, who has faced every other challenge with remarkable courage, agrees to the procedure. She spends what she believes might be her final night writing letters to Charles and other family members, expressing love and final political advice. To manage the excruciating pain of amputation, her physicians administer what they consider a safe dose of opium, the most effective painkiller available, imported from the Ottoman Empire at enormous expense. Margaret's wealth ensures she receives the finest preparation available. But 16th century understanding of proper dosage is primitive at best. The cruel irony unfolds with devastating swiftness. The opium meant to save her from surgical pain kills her before the amputation can begin. She falls into deep sleep and never awakens, dying peacefully but prematurely on December 1st, 1530. The woman who survived betrayal by kings, deaths of 2 husbands, political conspiracies, and threats of foreign invasion is ultimately defeated by a medical error involving a drug meant to help her. News of Margaret's death sends shockwaves throughout Europe. She had seemed indestructible, a figure who weathered every conceivable misfortune and emerged stronger each time. That she died from stepping on glass strikes contemporaries is so absurd that many initially refused to believe it. Charles V, her nephew and Holy Roman Emperor, reportedly weeps openly at her grave, declaring he has lost not just an aunt, but the wisest counselor he ever knew. The Netherlands mourns her as the first ruler in generations, who put their interests above foreign courts and dynasties. Margaret's funeral is attended by representatives from every major European power, testament to respect earned through decades of skilled governance. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of her legacy is how completely she transformed herself from victim into victor. The few, frightened child, humiliated at the French court, became one of Europe's most respected rulers. The grieving widow who lost 2 husbands and a child channeled pain into unprecedented political achievement. The woman, repeatedly discarded by men, ultimately proved herself stronger and more capable than those who rejected her. Modern historians recognize Margaret of Austria as one of the most effective rulers of the Renaissance period. Her diplomatic innovations influenced European statecraft for generations, while her administrative reforms served as models for effective governance throughout Habsburg domains. She succeeded not by conforming to traditional expectations of female behavior, but by transcending them entirely, creating a new paradigm for women in positions of power. The tragic circumstances of Margaret's death serve as a haunting reminder of how arbitrarily fate can strike down even the most remarkable individuals. In a life marked by extraordinary resilience and achievement, her end seems almost cosmically unfair, brought low not by great political struggles she had mastered, but by a fragment of glass and medical mistake. Yet there's perhaps strange appropriateness to Margaret's unusual death. Throughout her life, she faced each disaster with the same calm dignity, treating catastrophic losses and minor setbacks with equal composure. In her final weeks as infection ravaged her body, she reportedly maintained the same stoic acceptance that carried her through deaths of husbands and collapse of childhood dreams. The story of Margaret of Austria forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about randomness of fate and fragility of human achievement. Here was a woman who overcame every conceivable obstacle, who transformed personal tragedy into public triumph, who proved herself equal of any ruler in European history. Yet all her wisdom, strength, and accomplishment could not protect her from broken glass and physician's error. In our own age, when public figures often crumble at first sign of adversity, Margaret stands as example of what human resilience can achieve. She reminds us that our response to tragedy defines us more than tragedy itself. That strength comes not from avoiding pain, but from transforming it into purpose. Her greatest victory was not any particular diplomatic achievement or administrative reform, but the simple fact that she refused to let suffering have the final word in her story. The fragment of glass that killed her body could never touch the spirit that had already secured its place in eternity. The scared child who was pawned off by her father became a woman who commanded respect of emperors. The discarded bride humiliated by France became a ruler who helped shape European history's course. The grieving widow who lost everything found strength to serve something greater than her own happiness. And that, perhaps, is the most powerful lesson of all.